The glass tower of Morrison & Associates gleamed against the Manhattan skyline like a monument to corporate power and privilege. From my modest desk on the 15th floor, I had watched the city transform over 17 years. New buildings rising, old ones falling, the relentless churn of ambition and opportunity that defined New York's financial district. What hadn't changed was my position in the company hierarchy. Senior enough to handle complex projects, invisible enough to be easily discarded when convenient. "Pack your things, David." The voice belonged to Jonathan Morrison Jr., the CEO's golden boy who had inherited his corner office through DNA rather than merit. His smirk was particularly pronounced today, suggesting he had been savoring this moment longer than the standard corporate courtesy period would normally allow. "Your services are no longer required." I looked up from the presentation I'd been perfecting for the Blackstone Industries account. 6 months of work distilled into strategic recommendations that could revolutionize their global supply chain. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was being terminated while crafting solutions for a client worth 8 figures annually to the firm. May I ask why? I kept my voice level, though 17 years of observing Morrison family dynamics had already provided the answer. Junior had been systematically removing senior staff who predated his rise to power, replacing institutional knowledge with people who owed their careers to his patronage rather than professional competence. "Restructuring," he replied with casual cruelty. "We're moving in a different direction, focusing on younger talent with fresh perspectives." His gaze flicked meaningfully toward the team of recent MBA graduates he'd hired at salaries that exceeded what I'd earned after nearly 2 decades of building relationships and delivering results. The fresh perspectives currently struggled with basic client management and strategic thinking, but they possessed something I lacked: the proper social connections and willingness to laugh at Junior's jokes regardless of their quality. In Morrison's new vision for the company, loyalty mattered more than competence, and I had never mastered the art of corporate sycophancy that seemed essential for survival in the current regime. "Security will escort you out," Junior added, already turning away to indicate the conversation's conclusion. "Human Resources has your severance package ready, quite generous actually, considering your limited contributions in recent years." Limited contributions? The phrase was calculated to wound, dismissing years of successful project management and client relationship building as somehow inadequate by standards I had never been allowed to understand or meet. As security approached my desk with polite but firm authority, I began gathering personal items with the resigned dignity of someone who had always known this moment would eventually arrive. 17 years of dedication, innovation, and quiet excellence, ending with a smirk from a man half my age who had never earned anything through merit alone. The cardboard box containing my professional life felt lighter than expected as I carried it through the marble lobby of Morrison & Associates for the last time. 17 years of accumulated reports, client thank you notes, and industry awards reduced to a container that barely filled my arms. The security guard who had escorted me down maintained professional courtesy, though his sympathetic expression suggested he had witnessed this scene too many times recently. "Sorry about this, Mr. Chen," he murmured as we waited for the elevator. "Word around the building is that you were one of the good ones." The kindness in his comment nearly broke the composed facade I had maintained since Junior's dismissal. Building staff, administrative assistants, even junior associates had always treated me with genuine respect. Recognition that my reputation extended beyond the executive suite where political maneuvering determined career trajectories. The elevator arrived, empty except for our reflections in its polished steel walls. As we descended past floors filled with colleagues who would learn of my termination through corporate email announcements, I wondered how many others were quietly updating their resumes, recognizing that Junior's purge of experienced staff would likely continue until the company culture had been completely reshaped according to his preferences. "Your replacement won't last 6 months, the security guard added as we reached the lobby. "Nobody understands the Blackstone account like you did. That's going to bite them when renewal time comes." The Blackstone Industries relationship had been my particular expertise. 3 years of careful cultivation with Marcus Blackstone, the company's founder and CEO, whose demanding standards and complex personality had frustrated several previous account managers. I had succeeded by taking time to understand not just his business needs, but his vision for transforming American manufacturing through strategic international partnerships. The rain had intensified while I'd been clearing my desk, turning the afternoon into a study in gray that matched my emotional state. As I stood on the sidewalk outside the building where I'd spent my entire adult career, clutching my pathetic cardboard box while water soaked through my business suit, the magnitude of my situation began to register. At 43, with specialized skills in client relationship management and strategic consulting, I faced a job market that increasingly favored younger candidates with different technological expertise and lower salary expectations. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. Under normal circumstances, I might have let it go to voicemail, but unemployment had the immediate effect of making every communication potentially significant. David Chen speaking. Mr. Chen, this is Marcus Blackstone. I've been trying to reach you at Morrison & Associates, but they informed me you're no longer with the firm. The voice was unmistakable, gravelly from years of commanding factory floors and boardrooms, tinged with the slight southern accent that remained despite decades of international business. My heart began racing as I processed the implications of this call. Marcus Blackstone never contacted account managers directly. Our interactions had always been filtered through Morrison's senior partners, maintaining the hierarchy that emphasized the firm's prestige over individual relationships. That's correct, Mr. Blackstone. My employment was terminated this afternoon. A pause followed, filled with the sound of traffic and what sounded like papers shuffling on his end. Terminated? Just weeks before our major strategy session? That seems poorly timed from Morrison's perspective. The diplomatic phrasing couldn't mask his displeasure. The strategy session he referenced was scheduled for the following month, a comprehensive review of Blackstone Industries' 5-year expansion plan that represented millions in consulting fees for Morrison & Associates. I'm afraid you'll need to discuss implementation details with my former colleagues, I replied, professional obligation overriding personal satisfaction at the complications my termination would create for Junior's carefully planned restructuring. Actually, Marcus said, his tone shifting in a way that made me straighten despite standing on a rain-soaked sidewalk. I was calling to discuss a different arrangement. Are you available for lunch tomorrow? I have a proposition that might interest you. The unexpected invitation sent a surge of possibility through my chest. Marcus Blackstone was legendary in business circles, not just for his company's success, but for his loyalty to people who delivered results regardless of their institutional affiliations. If he was suggesting what I thought he might be suggesting, I'm available, I confirmed, my voice steadier than I had expected given the day's emotional roller coaster. Excellent. The Union Club, 12:30. Ask for the Morrison reservation. The Morrison reservation. Even separated from the company, he was maintaining the professional courtesies that had characterized our working relationship, though the irony of using the Morrison name for a meeting that might directly compete with Morrison & Associates wasn't lost on either of us. As I ended the call and hailed a taxi home, the cardboard box no longer felt like a symbol of professional failure, but rather evidence of freedom from constraints that had limited my potential for years. Junior's smirk had been premature. The very client relationships he had inherited but never earned were about to demonstrate the difference between position and actual value, between inherited authority and genuine competence. The Union Club's dining room embodied the kind of understated elegance that communicated power without ostentation. Dark wood paneling, crystal glasses that caught the afternoon light, and the hushed conversations of men and women who controlled billions in assets while maintaining the civilized demeanor that old money demanded. Marcus Blackstone had chosen this venue deliberately, I realized, as both a demonstration of respect and a subtle message about the caliber of opportunity he was about to present. He rose as I approached the table, his handshake firm and his assessment direct in the way that had made him legendary among suppliers and competitors alike. At 62, Marcus had the weathered appearance of someone who had built his fortune through hands-on engagement rather than financial engineering, his expensive suit unable to completely disguise the blue-collar origins that remained central to his identity. "David, thank you for coming on such short notice," he began once we were seated. "I trust yesterday's developments at Morrison came as something of a shock." "That's an understatement," I admitted, appreciating his directness after years of corporate diplomacy that obscured rather than illuminated actual situations. "Though I can't say I'm entirely surprised. The company culture has been shifting toward different priorities since Junior assumed operational control. Marcus nodded, his expression suggesting he had been observing these changes with interest. Jonathan Morrison Sr. built that firm on relationships and results. His son seems more interested in appearances and internal politics, a perspective that rarely leads to sustainable client satisfaction. The assessment was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating observable facts rather than offering personal criticism. Marcus had worked with Morrison and Associates for over a decade. His evaluation of their evolution carried the weight of extensive direct experience. "I've been watching your work specifically for the past 3 years," he continued, surprising me with this revelation. "The supply chain analysis you developed for our Southeast Asian operations saved us approximately $12 million in the first year alone. The regulatory compliance framework you designed for our European expansion eliminated problems that typically plague American companies entering those markets." These specific references to projects I had managed demonstrated a level of attention to individual contributions that I had never expected from someone at Marcus's level of the corporate hierarchy. Most CEOs interfaced primarily with senior partners, receiving credit for successful initiatives while remaining insulated from the details of who actually generated the valuable insights and solutions. Junior Morrison took credit for most of that work, I observed, testing whether Marcus had been aware of the internal dynamics that had shaped my tenure at the firm. His smile carried a hint of steel beneath its warmth. Of course he did, which is precisely why I prefer working directly with the people who actually produce results, rather than those who merely manage the presentation of achievements.
The waiter arrived to take our orders, providing a momentary pause that allowed me to process the implications of Marcus's comments. This wasn't simply a social lunch or courtesy meeting following my termination. He was building towards something specific that required this careful establishment of context and mutual understanding.
"David," he said once we were alone again, "I'm prepared to offer you a position as my Director of Strategic Development, a newly created role that would involve working directly with me on Blackstone Industries' most significant expansion and innovation initiatives." The offer hit me like a physical force. Director-level positions at companies like Blackstone typically went to people with decades of senior management experience or advanced degrees from prestigious business schools. My background, solid but unremarkable, hardly seemed to qualify for such a dramatic elevation. "The salary would be 3 times what Morrison was paying you," Marcus continued, apparently interpreting my silence as negotiation rather than shock. "Plus equity participation in projects you develop successfully, and complete autonomy in building your team and strategic approach. 3 times my Morrison salary would transform my financial situation from comfortable to genuinely prosperous. Equity participation could eventually generate wealth beyond anything I had imagined possible through traditional employment. But most appealing was the autonomy, the freedom to apply strategic thinking without filtering every decision through layers of corporate politics and approval processes." "Why me?" I asked, needing to understand what had prompted such an extraordinary offer from someone whose success depended on making sound judgments about people and opportunities. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his expression taking on the reflective quality of someone who had given considerable thought to the question. "Because you understand something that most business consultants miss. That sustainable success requires genuine partnership rather than mere transactional relationships. Your approach to our account has consistently prioritized long-term value creation over short-term fee maximization." The assessment aligned with how I had approached all client relationships throughout my career, focusing on delivering solutions that actually addressed underlying business challenges rather than simply fulfilling contracted requirements. This perspective had occasionally created tension with Morrison partners, who measured success primarily through billable hours and renewal rates. "Additionally," Marcus continued, "you've demonstrated the ability to see opportunities that others miss, not through superior technical knowledge, but through careful attention to human and cultural factors that influence business outcomes. That combination of analytical rigor and intuitive understanding is remarkably rare." His specific examples of my analytical insights and strategic recommendations revealed a level of attention to my individual contributions that was both flattering and slightly unnerving. Marcus Blackstone had clearly been evaluating my performance with an intention I had never suspected. "There is one condition," he added, his tone becoming more serious. The position would require relocating to Atlanta, where Blackstone's headquarters are expanding. The role demands proximity to operations and regular travel to our international facilities. Relocation would mean leaving New York, the city where I had built my career and established what social connections existed outside my professional life. But it would also mean complete separation from the Morrison & Associates environment, where Junior's influence would likely continue to impact my professional reputation regardless of my physical departure from the company. "I accept," I said without hesitation, the decision feeling both spontaneous and inevitable. "When would you want me to start?" Marcus's smile broadened, suggesting my quick acceptance had met or exceeded his expectations. "Immediately, if possible. In fact, there's something I'd like you to handle personally, something that I believe will provide an excellent introduction to your new responsibilities while addressing an urgent competitive situation." The urgent competitive situation Marcus had referenced proved to be more personal than I had anticipated. As we concluded lunch and prepared to discuss immediate next steps, he handed me a folder marked Morrison & Associates, Transition Analysis, that contained detailed intelligence about my former employer's current vulnerabilities and strategic miscalculations. Junior Morrison has made several costly errors since assuming operational control, Marcus explained, his tone carrying the dispassionate assessment of a competitor evaluating market opportunities. "Losing experienced staff like yourself, pursuing clients through price cutting rather than value demonstration, and most significantly, neglecting the relationship maintenance that his father understood was essential to long-term success." The folder contained alarming information about Morrison's recent performance, client defections, project failures, and a pattern of cost overruns that suggested fundamental problems with strategic planning and execution. Junior's emphasis on younger, cheaper talent was generating short-term profit improvements, but creating longer-term operational weaknesses that competitors were beginning to exploit. "Your termination yesterday was the final confirmation I needed that Junior lacks the judgment necessary to maintain the standards his father established," Marcus continued, "which creates an opportunity for Blackstone Industries to reconsider our consulting relationships." The implications of this statement sent a chill of excitement through me. Blackstone's account represented Morrison & Associates' largest source of revenue. Losing it would create immediate financial crisis and potentially trigger the firm's collapse if other major clients followed similar patterns. "You're considering terminating your relationship with Morrison?" I asked, wanting to confirm what seemed almost too good to be true. "I'm considering transferring our business to a more competent strategic partner," Marcus corrected with precision that emphasized the professional rather than vindictive nature of his decision. "The consulting arrangement we've maintained for over a decade has been valuable, but relationships with firms are ultimately relationships with individuals. When those individuals are replaced by less capable alternatives." He allowed the sentence to hang unfinished, its implications clear to both of us. This wasn't merely about my termination, but about the broader degradation of Morrison's capabilities under Junior's leadership. "Your first assignment as Director of Strategic Development would be to manage the transition of our consulting needs to alternative providers," Marcus explained, his eyes glinting with anticipation, "including the comprehensive evaluation of Morrison's replacement that we would announce tomorrow morning." The timeline was breathtakingly aggressive, less than 24 hours from my humiliating termination to becoming the architect of my former employer's potential destruction. Junior's smirk would transform into panic when he learned that his decision to fire me had directly triggered the loss of his company's most valuable client relationship. "I should mention," Marcus added with what might have been subtle amusement, "that we've scheduled a meeting with Morrison's senior team for Friday morning to discuss evolving strategic requirements and partnership expectations. I thought you might find it educational to observe their presentation." The prospect of sitting across from Junior Morrison as he desperately attempted to preserve the client relationship his arrogance had just destroyed was almost too delicious to contemplate. Justice served with corporate precision and professional courtesy. Exactly the kind of elegant revenge that Marcus's reputation suggested he excelled at delivering. "There are ethical considerations," I said, my conscience asserting itself despite the emotional appeal of immediate vindication. "I have access to confidential information about Morrison's strategies and client management approaches. Using that information against them could raise legal and professional issues. Marcus nodded approvingly, as if my concern about ethical boundaries was exactly the response he had hoped to hear. Which is why the transition will be handled through proper competitive processes rather than insider advantage. You'll recuse yourself from any decisions involving proprietary Morrison information, while focusing on developing superior approaches that demonstrate Blackstone's strategic thinking, rather than merely exploiting our previous consultant's weaknesses. This distinction between earning business through superior capability and stealing it through unethical advantage reflected the principled approach to competition that had built Marcus's reputation as both a formidable adversary and an honorable business partner. He played hard, but played fair, expecting the same standards from those who worked with and for him.
However, he continued with a slight edge entering his voice, there's nothing unethical about ensuring that Morrison's leadership understands the full consequences of their personnel decisions. Junior Morrison fired one of the most valuable members of his team for reasons that had nothing to do with performance. The market should respond accordingly to such poor judgment.
As we finalized arrangements for my immediate transition to Blackstone, signing employment agreements, discussing relocation logistics, and scheduling meetings with senior staff I would begin working with, I felt a transformation occurring that extended beyond mere career advancement. For the first time in years, I was operating from a position of genuine recognition and respect rather than tolerated competence. The most satisfying aspect wasn't the substantial salary increase or even the prospect of revenge against Junior Morrison, but the validation that my work had been observed and valued by someone whose own success depended on accurate assessment of talent and capability. Marcus Blackstone didn't make emotional hiring decisions or offer positions based on personal sympathy. He invested in people because he believed they would generate returns that justified the investment. One final question, I said as we prepared to leave the club. How long have you been planning this? The timing of your offer, coming immediately after my termination, suggests preparation rather than spontaneous response. Marcus's smile confirmed my suspicion. I've been monitoring Morrison's evolution for months, particularly Junior's systematic replacement of experienced staff with less qualified but more politically acceptable alternatives. Your termination was anticipated. The specific timing was the only variable. This revelation, that my firing had been predicted and planned for by the very client whose account I had been managing, added another layer to what was already an extraordinary reversal of circumstances. Marcus had been positioning to recruit me before Junior had decided to fire me, creating a situation where my termination would immediately benefit the person being terminated while damaging those responsible for the decision. Junior Morrison has no idea what he's just set in motion, Marcus observed with satisfaction as we walked toward the club's exit. By tomorrow evening, he'll begin to understand that dismissing competent people has consequences that extend far beyond corporate restructuring plans. As I stepped back onto Manhattan's busy streets, the same rain that had seemed so depressing an hour earlier now felt refreshing, cleansing rather than punishing, marking the transition from one chapter of my career to another that promised both personal vindication and professional advancement beyond anything I had dared to imagine while trapped in Morrison's increasingly toxic culture. The cardboard box under my arm no longer represented the end of something valuable, but the beginning of possibilities that Junior Morrison's arrogance and poor judgment had inadvertently created. Sometimes the most satisfying justice came not through revenge, but through the natural consequences of other people's failures catching up with them in precisely the ways they most deserved. The Morrison & Associates conference room felt smaller than I remembered, though perhaps that was simply the psychological effect of viewing it from across the table rather than as a participant in its carefully orchestrated power dynamics. Junior Morrison sat at the head of the polished surface with forced confidence, flanked by the young MBA graduates who constituted his new strategic team. His expression carried the same arrogant certainty that had characterized his dismissal of me just 5 days earlier. Mr. Whitmore, Morrison Sr.'s longtime partner who had somehow survived Junior's purge, appeared deeply uncomfortable as he reviewed the notes for what everyone understood was a make-or-break presentation. Losing the Blackstone account would eliminate nearly 30% of the firm's revenue and likely trigger a cascade of other client departures once word spread about their inability to maintain major relationships. Thank you for accommodating this meeting on short notice. Marcus began from his position at the opposite end of the table, his tone carrying the polite formality that preceded either significant business developments or professional executions. As you know, Blackstone Industries is entering a critical expansion phase that will require enhanced strategic support. Junior leaned forward eagerly, clearly anticipating this would be the moment when Blackstone announced increased consulting requirements that would validate his restructuring decisions and demonstrate the superiority of his fresh approach to client management. We've been extremely satisfied with Morrison's historical performance, Marcus continued, particularly the innovative approaches developed by David Chen over our 3-year partnership. At the mention of my name, Junior's expression faltered slightly, the first indication that this meeting might not proceed according to his expectations. Whitmore glanced at his notes nervously, clearly struggling to address references to my contributions without acknowledging the awkwardness of my recent termination. David provided valuable insights, Junior replied with forced magnanimity, though we've since developed even more sophisticated analytical frameworks through our expanded team capabilities. The claim was transparently false. The young associates sitting around him lacked both the industry experience and client relationship skills necessary to replicate the strategic approaches I had developed over years of working directly with Marcus's operational requirements. I'm sure your new team is quite capable, Marcus agreed with diplomatic neutrality. However, Blackstone's evolving needs require continuity of relationships and institutional knowledge that typically develops over extended periods of direct collaboration. The phrasing was beginning to suggest a direction that made Junior visibly uncomfortable. His earlier confidence was giving way to defensive alertness as he recognized that this might not be the expanded partnership opportunity he had anticipated. Which brings me to the purpose of today's meeting, Marcus continued, his tone shifting subtly toward the authority that had built Blackstone Industries into a global presence. Effective immediately, we'll be transitioning our strategic consulting requirements to Blackstone Strategic Development, our new internal division directed by David Chen. The words landed in absolute silence. Junior's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally horrified comprehension as the implications registered. Not only was Blackstone terminating their relationship with Morrison and Associates, but they were doing so specifically to work with the very person Junior had so casually discarded. This is highly irregular, Whitmore finally managed, his voice strained. David has contractual obligations, non-compete clauses, confidentiality agreements that would prevent him from working directly with Blackstone clients. Alessandro Benedetti, who had been observing silently from his position beside Marcus, spoke for the first time. Mr. Chen's employment agreements with Morrison contained standard provisions that become void upon termination without cause. Additionally, non-compete restrictions cannot prevent professionals from using general industry knowledge and capabilities developed over years of legitimate experience. His accent and formal manner immediately identified him as expensive legal counsel, the kind of attorney who specialized in high-stakes corporate disputes and typically prevailed through superior preparation rather than emotional appeal. Junior had recovered enough to attempt salvaging something from the disaster unfolding before him. Mr. Blackstone, surely we can discuss this situation reasonably. David was a valued member of our team, but his departure was part of strategic restructuring designed to better serve clients like yourself. By firing your most effective account manager? Marcus asked with the mild curiosity of someone genuinely puzzled by incomprehensible business logic. David was the primary reason our partnership worked so effectively. Removing him while expecting to maintain our business relationship suggests a fundamental misunderstanding of what we valued about the arrangement. The exchange was proceeding exactly as Marcus had predicted during our preparation sessions. Junior's arrogance and poor judgment being exposed through his own words and reactions, rather than through external criticism that could be dismissed as unfair or vindictive. We'd be happy to consider adjusting the team assignments, Junior offered desperately, apparently beginning to grasp the financial catastrophe his personnel decisions had created. Perhaps David could be brought back in a consulting capacity for the Blackstone account specifically. David is no longer available for consulting work with Morrison, I said, speaking directly for the first time since the meeting began. My new position at Blackstone requires exclusive focus on their strategic requirements. The statement, delivered with calm professionalism, represented a complete reversal of our power dynamic from the previous week. Junior's smirk had been replaced by pale recognition that his casual cruelty had triggered consequences extending far beyond my personal disappointment to encompass the potential destruction of everything he had inherited. The 6 months following my transition to Blackstone Strategic Development exceeded even Marcus's optimistic projections for both individual performance and division impact. Operating with genuine autonomy and substantial resources, I had recruited a team of experienced consultants who shared my philosophy of delivering measurable value rather than merely fulfilling contracted obligations. Our first major initiative, a comprehensive analysis of global supply chain vulnerabilities, had identified cost savings and efficiency improvements worth over $50 million annually. More satisfying than financial results was the cultural transformation occurring within my new professional environment. Marcus had created space for strategic thinking that prioritized long-term relationships and sustainable practices over quarterly optimization, approaches that attracted both exceptional talent and clients who valued substance over superficial presentations. The ripple effects of Blackstone's departure from Morrison & Associates had unfolded exactly as Marcus had anticipated. Within 3 months, 2 other major clients had terminated their relationships, citing concerns about service quality and strategic capability. Junior Morrison's restructuring had indeed modernized the firm into irrelevance as experienced professionals departed for competitors, while client confidence eroded through repeated project failures and communication breakdowns. Morrison & Associates posted a 30% revenue decline last quarter, reported Jennifer Walsh, the former Morrison senior associate who had joined my team after Junior's purge had eliminated her advancement opportunities. Industry sources suggest they're exploring merger possibilities with smaller firms to maintain operational viability. The information, while professionally relevant to our competitive intelligence gathering, carried personal satisfaction that I tried not to dwell on too obviously. Junior's smirk had preceded his company's near collapse by less than a year, a timeline that demonstrated how quickly arrogance and poor judgment could destroy value that had required decades to build. Any word on their approach to the technological solutions account? I asked, referring to a client Morrison had been pursuing before my departure, a relationship I had initiated through preliminary discussions, but hadn't formalized before my termination. Jennifer's expression suggested amusement at my question. They lost it to Henderson & Associates last month. Apparently, the client specifically asked whether David Chen would be involved in the project management. When Morrison couldn't provide that assurance, Technological Solutions went with Henderson instead. This pattern, clients prioritizing relationships with specific individuals over firm reputation, had become increasingly common as word spread about Morrison's talent exodus and declining service quality. The consulting industry operated fundamentally on personal relationships and demonstrated competence. Junior's focus on internal politics over client satisfaction had undermined the very foundations of sustainable business success. Speaking of client relationships, Jennifer continued, we received an interesting inquiry yesterday. Morrison's former client Pacific Rim Industries is exploring alternative consulting arrangements. Their CEO mentioned being particularly interested in David's approach to international partnership development. The possibility of additional defections from Morrison's client base created mixed emotions, professional excitement about expanding Blackstone Strategic Development's portfolio, balanced against awareness that each success contributed to the destruction of a firm where many former colleagues remained employed despite Junior's mismanagement. We should be careful not to appear predatory, I cautioned, thinking of the ethical standards Marcus had emphasized throughout my transition. Winning business through superior service is appropriate. Actively undermining former colleagues crosses lines we shouldn't cross. Agreed, Jennifer replied, though there's nothing unethical about responding to legitimate inquiries from prospective clients who have heard about our work and are considering their options independently. This distinction between aggressive business development and responsive service to genuine market interest would guide our approach to the opportunities created by Morrison's decline. We would compete fairly, but wouldn't hesitate to demonstrate superior capabilities when clients initiated comparisons. My secure office phone rang with the distinctive tone that indicated a call routed through Marcus's executive assistant, priority communications that required immediate attention regardless of other activities. "David, I have Marcus Blackstone on the line," came the familiar voice of his assistant. "He asked me to interrupt your current meeting." I accepted the call, noting Jennifer's immediate attention to this interruption by the CEO himself, a level of direct access that confirmed my unusual position within the Blackstone hierarchy. "David, we have a developing situation that requires your immediate attention," Marcus began without preamble. "I just received a call from Senator Richardson's office requesting urgent consultation on international trade policy implications of the semiconductor legislation currently before Congress." This type of high-level government consulting represented the most prestigious work in our industry, projects that combined substantial fees with significant influence on policy decisions affecting global business operations. The fact that specific requests were being made for my involvement suggested my reputation was expanding beyond immediate client relationships to broader recognition within political and business circles. "The senator's staff specifically asked for you by name," Marcus continued, his tone carrying both pride and slight amazement. "Apparently, your work on our Asian expansion strategy has been discussed in policy circles as an innovative approach to maintaining competitive advantage while respecting international regulatory frameworks." This unexpected expansion of my professional recognition beyond direct client relationships represented validation of analytical approaches I had developed without considering their broader applicability. The strategic frameworks that had served Blackstone's specific needs apparently offered insights valuable to policymakers, grappling with similar challenges at national and international levels. "When do they need our response?" I asked, already mentally shifting to the complex preparation such high-profile consulting would require. "The initial briefing is scheduled for Monday morning at Richardson's Washington office," Marcus replied. "This could establish Blackstone's strategic development as a major player in policy consulting, a market sector worth hundreds of millions annually and typically dominated by firms with decades of government relationship building." The opportunity was extraordinary, but also intimidating, representing a quantum leap in professional responsibility and public visibility that would permanently elevate my career beyond anything possible at Morrison & Associates. Success could establish me as a recognized expert in international business strategy. Failure would be equally visible and professionally devastating. "I'll be ready," I confirmed, commitment overriding anxiety as I contemplated the preparation required for such high-stakes consulting. "Excellent," Marcus replied with evident satisfaction. "And David, Junior Morrison will undoubtedly learn about this development through industry channels. I thought you might appreciate knowing that his decision to terminate you has now directly contributed to establishing you as his primary competitor in the government consulting market." The Senate hearing room buzzed with barely contained energy as Senator Richardson's committee prepared to question witnesses about the proposed International Technology Competitiveness Act. From my position at the witness table, I could observe the packed gallery where corporate executives, lobbyists, and journalists had gathered to monitor proceedings that would shape American business policy for the next decade. My written testimony, developed through intensive collaboration with Blackstone's policy team, argued for regulatory frameworks that enhanced American competitiveness while maintaining ethical standards in international partnerships, a nuanced position that had attracted bipartisan interest and considerable media attention. "Mr. Chen," Senator Richardson began once the formal introductions had concluded, "your strategic analysis suggests that current approaches to international trade regulation are simultaneously too restrictive and insufficiently protective. Could you elaborate on this apparent contradiction?" The question went to the heart of the policy framework I had developed through years of managing complex international client relationships. Recognition that effective regulation required sophisticated understanding of global business realities rather than simple restrictions that often pushed economic activity toward less transparent alternatives. "Senator, the most effective regulatory approaches create competitive advantages for companies that operate according to high ethical standards while making it difficult for those cutting corners to achieve market success," I began, drawing on examples from Blackstone's operations across multiple international markets. "This requires frameworks that are complex enough to address actual business practices, but clear enough to provide regulatory certainty." As I outlined specific policy recommendations developed through Blackstone's global experience, I noticed movement in the gallery that caught my attention. Junior Morrison had entered with several Morrison and Associates colleagues, their presence clearly intended to monitor my testimony and assess its implications for their own client relationships. His expression when our eyes met briefly across the room was no longer the smirk that had characterized my termination 6 months earlier. Instead, I saw something approaching panic. Recognition that the person he had dismissed as expendable was now testifying before Congress as a recognized expert in precisely the areas where Morrison and Associates had previously claimed specialized expertise. Your recommendations seem to align closely with the operational approach of Blackstone Industries, observed Senator Williams, the committee's ranking minority member. How do we ensure that regulatory frameworks serve broader national interests rather than primarily benefiting specific companies? The question addressed legitimate concerns about regulatory capture, the tendency for industry experts to advocate for policies that served their employers' interests rather than general economic welfare. My response required balancing advocacy for effective approaches with acknowledgement of this inherent conflict. The principles I'm recommending aren't unique to Blackstone, I replied. They reflect best practices observable across companies that have achieved sustainable success in international markets through ethical operations rather than regulatory arbitrage. The goal should be creating incentives that encourage all American companies to compete through value creation rather than cost-cutting that ultimately undermines competitive position. As questioning continued through the afternoon, I found myself fielding increasingly sophisticated inquiries about implementation challenges, enforcement mechanisms, and potential unintended consequences. The senators' evident respect for my expertise and the substantive nature of their questions confirmed that this testimony was influencing actual policy development rather than serving merely as public theater. During a brief recess, Alessandro approached from his position in the gallery, where he had been monitoring proceedings as Marcus's representative. "Exceptional performance," he murmured quietly. "The policy committee staffers are already requesting follow-up meetings to discuss implementation specifics." This confirmation that my testimony was generating concrete policy interest validated the strategic thinking I had developed over years of international business consulting. More importantly, it established my credibility as an expert whose insights extended beyond narrow corporate interests to encompass broader economic and security considerations. "Junior Morrison requested a brief conversation during the break," Alessandro added with barely concealed amusement. "He's waiting in the corridor, apparently hoping to discuss potential collaboration opportunities between Blackstone Strategic Development and Morrison and Associates." The desperate irony wasn't lost on me. The man who had fired me with casual cruelty was now seeking opportunities to associate his struggling firm with my success. His presence at the hearing represented recognition that I had achieved the kind of professional prominence that could potentially rescue Morrison's declining reputation through association. "What did you tell him?" I asked, curious about Alessandro's response to what was clearly a humiliating reversal of Junior's earlier position. "That your schedule is completely committed to serving Blackstone's strategic requirements," Alessandro replied, with professional courtesy that carried an unmistakable undertone of dismissal. "Though I suggested he might follow your testimony in trade publications, as your insights could provide valuable education about effective international business strategy." 1 year after Junior Morrison's smirk had preceded my supposed professional destruction, I stood in the executive conference room of Blackstone Strategic Development's New Washington office, reviewing the quarterly report that would be delivered to Marcus that afternoon. The numbers told a story of unprecedented growth. Revenue up 340% from our inaugural year. Client base expanded to include Fortune 500 companies and government agencies. Professional recognition that had established BSD as a premier consulting firm specializing in ethical international business strategy. The personal transformation had been equally dramatic. From overlooked middle manager to director of strategic development to CEO of an independent division, my career trajectory had accelerated in ways that vindicated every strategic decision I had made, despite family and colleagues who had questioned the wisdom of prioritizing principles over political positioning. "The Morrison situation has reached its conclusion," reported Maria Santos, my director of operations, as she updated me on competitive intelligence our firm maintained about industry developments. "They filed for Chapter 11 protection yesterday. Junior Morrison has been removed as CEO by the creditors committee. The information, while not unexpected given Morrison's continued deterioration over the past year, still carried emotional complexity. Justice for Junior's arrogance and poor judgment had been delivered by market forces rather than personal vendetta, a more satisfying resolution than any revenge I could have orchestrated deliberately. Several Morrison associates have requested informational interviews, Maria continued, including some senior staff who were retained during Junior's restructuring, but are now seeking alternative positions given the firm's uncertain future. This development, experienced consultants from my former employer seeking opportunities with the very division I had built in response to my termination, represented the complete reversal of circumstances that Marcus had predicted when offering me this position. The people who had witnessed my dismissal with indifference or secret relief were now hoping to benefit from association with my subsequent success. We'll evaluate applications according to our standard criteria, I decided, maintaining the professional objectivity that had characterized my approach throughout this extraordinary year. Personal history with Morrison won't be held against qualified candidates, but it won't provide automatic advantages either. The principle reflected strategic thinking that had guided all my decisions since joining Blackstone, competing through superior performance rather than settling personal scores, building success through positive contributions rather than merely undermining competitors' weaknesses. My assistant interrupted with notification that Marcus was calling from Atlanta headquarters. His voice carried the satisfaction of someone whose investment had generated returns even exceeding optimistic projections. "Congratulations on another exceptional quarter," he began. "The client satisfaction ratings and project outcome metrics continue to establish new benchmarks for the consulting industry." "The team has been remarkable," I replied, meaning it. "Having resources and autonomy to recruit based purely on competence rather than internal politics makes an enormous difference in results." "Speaking of results," Marcus continued, "I received an interesting call yesterday from Jonathan Morrison Sr. He's returned from retirement to attempt salvaging what remains of his firm and wanted to discuss potential acquisition of BSD as a way to restore Morrison's market position." This development was unexpected but not entirely surprising. Morrison Sr. had built the firm's original reputation through exactly the kind of relationship-focused consulting that his son had dismantled. His proposal to acquire my division represented recognition that the expertise he had once valued was now operating successfully outside his organizational structure. "What was your response?" I asked, curious about Marcus's reaction to an offer that would essentially reverse the competitive displacement that had followed my termination. "I told him that BSD wasn't for sale at any price," Marcus replied with evident satisfaction, "but that if he was serious about rebuilding Morrison's capabilities, he might consider recruiting David Chen as CEO of the reconstituted firm." The suggestion was so audacious it took my breath away, returning to lead the very company that had discarded me, but this time with complete authority to reshape its culture and strategic approach, according to principles that had proven successful at Blackstone. "What do you think?" Marcus asked, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity about my reaction to this ultimate reversal of fortune. I considered the possibility carefully, the symmetry of triumph, the opportunity to transform Morrison and Associates into the kind of firm it could have remained under different leadership, the satisfaction of success measured not just through personal advancement, but through institutional improvement. "I think," I replied slowly, "that sometimes the most complete vindication comes not from watching your enemies fail, but from succeeding so thoroughly that they eventually recognize your value and seek your leadership." The client who had asked for me by name had indeed transformed everything, not just my career trajectory, but my understanding of how professional worth is ultimately determined by results rather than politics, by competence rather than connections, by the kind of sustained excellence that creates opportunities others can neither anticipate nor prevent. Junior Morrison's smirk had preceded his downfall by exactly the duration it had taken the market to recognize that, in firing me, he had eliminated the very capability that made his firm valuable to its most important clients. That justice, delivered through natural consequences rather than deliberate revenge, felt more complete than any vindication I could have engineered through personal malice. As I prepared to consider Morrison Sr.'s unexpected offer, the chance to transform my former employer into an organization worthy of the reputation it had once possessed, I reflected on the extraordinary year that had proven merit inevitably rises while mediocrity inevitably falls, regardless of temporary advantages provided by inherited position or political maneuvering. The overlooked consultant had become the industry leader, the dismissed employee had become the sought-after CEO, and the man who had laughed at my professional destruction was now seeking opportunities to serve the very person he had so casually discarded. Sometimes the most perfect justice was simply allowing natural consequences to unfold according to their own inexorable logic. If you enjoyed this story of professional revenge, corporate intrigue, and ultimate vindication, please subscribe to my channel for more tales that explore the dangerous games people play with power, loyalty, and ambition. In my next video, we'll discover another riveting narrative where underestimated individuals prove that competence and integrity ultimately triumph over privilege and politics. Until then, remember that in business as in life, the last laugh often belongs to those who earn it through excellence rather than inheritance.